Julia Price had already refused 3 men when Owen Mercer asked for the last dance, because that one had belonged to Wade Turner for 3 Octobers, whether he claimed it or not. The harvest hall shone like a lantern against the dark Colorado fields. Yellow light spilled through its open doors, catching dust above the floorboards. Inside, skirts moved between black coats and polished boots. Outside, Wade stood beside the hitch rail with his hat low and his hands resting on the top board. He had not entered. Julia kept her face calm as Owen waited for her answer. He was 36, broad-shouldered, neatly dressed, and successful enough that half the mothers in the room had already measured him against their unmarried daughters. "You may have the schottisch," Julia said, glancing at the chalkboard beside the musicians. 6 dances were listed in white chalk, but not the last one. Owen followed her glance toward the doorway. Wade looked away first. "I thought it might already be spoken for," Owen said. "It is not spoken for. That was the trouble." Julia's cream-colored dance card hung from a narrow ribbon at her wrist. 5 lines carried names in careful pencil. The 6th remained blank. Its corners had softened beneath her thumb, just as they had during the 3 harvest socials before this one. She had never written Wade's name there. She had only left room for it. Owen gave her a small bow. "Then I will be grateful for the schottisch." He did not tease her, and Julia respected him for that. She crossed the floor to check the cider table and sent a boy for more firewood before the stove burned low. When an apple cake slipped sideways on its plate, Julia found a clean cloth, shifted the slices, and made the table look intentional again. Work had always been easier than waiting. At the doorway, Wade spoke to every rancher who stopped beside him. He laughed once. The sound carried clearly enough for Julia to remember how easily he had laughed before his wife died. He had danced beautifully then. The fiddlers began tuning for the first set. Couples moved toward the center of the floor, but Wade stayed beyond the threshold. 3 years earlier, Julia had told herself he only needed time. The next year, she had believed he needed certainty. Last October, she had decided patience was not the same as foolishness. Tonight, she was no longer sure. Near the coat pegs, a serving girl dropped a tray of cups. Julia caught one before it struck the floor and knelt to gather the others. By the time she stood, Owen had crossed the room and stepped outside. He stopped beside Wade. Julia should have returned to the cider table. Instead, she carried the rescued cups toward the doorway. "You know she watches for you," Owen said quietly. Wade's shoulders tightened beneath his dark coat. "She watches the door," he answered. "She watches you." A gust pressed cold air through the hall. Julia stopped behind the open door, hidden by its heavy planks. Owen did not sound triumphant. "I have no wish to stand where another man has been invited." Wade looked through the doorway. His gaze settled on Julia's place near the cider table, now empty. "She deserves a man willing to step inside," he said. "Perhaps she should decide what she deserves." Wade lowered his eyes. "A man my age ought to know when to leave a young woman free." Julia's grip tightened around the cups. Owen was silent for a moment. "Is that what she asked you to do?" The first fiddle tune began before Wade answered. "No," he said, "but it is what is best for her." Julia stepped back from the door before either man saw her. One of the cups cracked softly between her fingers. Across the hall, the chalkboard still showed 6 dances. For the first time, Julia understood that Wade was not merely waiting for courage. He had already made a choice, and he had made it for her. Julia set the cracked cup behind the cider barrel and crossed the hall before the first dance had finished. Wade had moved toward the wagon line, where the lantern light weakened. Owen remained near the doorway, but Julia passed him without speaking. "Wade!" He stopped. She held up the dance card between 2 fingers. "Did you tell Owen Mercer what was best for me?" Wade looked toward the hall, as though the music might offer him somewhere else to stand. "I told him you deserved a fair chance." "A fair chance at what?" "At a life that does not ask you to spend your best years waiting on a man who has already had his—" Julia stepped closer. Cold wind lifted her hair. "You helped rebuild my barn after lightning took the north wall," she said. "You worked 12 days and would not take payment. You have crossed my pasture in snow because you saw smoke coming wrong from my chimney. You have never once treated me as helpless until now. That is different." "No, it is only easier for you." His jaw tightened. You are 33 and able to count? A faint sound escaped him, almost a laugh, but it died before reaching his eyes. Julia lowered the card. My age is not an argument. Yours is not a verdict. If you do not want the dance, say so, but do not hand it to another man and call that kindness. Wade looked at her then. Grief had marked his face, but not made him old in the ways he believed. I do want it, he said. The honesty struck harder than refusal. Then why have you never asked? He glanced toward the music. Because wanting is not the same as having the right. You do not have the right to refuse for me either. The wind hit them broadside. Julia's ribbon snapped free from her wrist. The dance card spun beneath the wagon tongue, skidded through mud, and struck the rear wheel. Wade caught it before another gust carried it into the dark. He stared. Rain had blurred the pencil names, but the final line remained empty. Above it, faint marks showed where Julia had erased Wade's initials after each of the previous 3 harvest socials. The paper had been rubbed thin there. He touched the worn place with his thumb. You saved it every year. Julia took the card from him. Mud darkened the lower edge, and the torn ribbon hung from one corner. I left you a choice every year. His face changed, but she did not let that soften her. An unanswered invitation does not remain open forever. Wade. Inside. The first tune ended and couples cleared the floor. The chalkboard now held 5 dances. Wade removed his hat. Julia, I never meant to make you feel foolish. You did not. That is not what the town thinks. The town does not live my life. A gust rattled the wagons. Beneath Wade's seat, a damp grain sack shifted against the boards. Julia saw the outline of boots inside it, finer than the pair he wore for ranch work. He followed her gaze and moved in front of the wagon too late. You brought them, she said. Wade said nothing. The second dance began inside Harvest Hall. Julia folded the damaged card and placed it carefully in her pocket. You came prepared to dance and still chose the doorway? I thought bringing them might be enough. For whom? He had no answer. Thunder rolled beyond the western ridge. Horses along the rail lifted their heads as sleet began ticking against the wagon canvas. Julia turned toward her mare. The next gust struck hard enough to wrench one end of the hitch rail from its post. The rail dropped. Ropes tangled, and 3 frightened horses crowded sideways. Julia's mare was trapped in the center. Julia reached the hitch line before the fallen rail dragged another foot. Leave the knots, she called. Take the calm horses first. 2 men rushed toward the nearest ropes. Not those, the gray team. Her mare, Belle, was pinned between Wade's gelding and a sorrel wagon horse rolling its eyes at the sleet. The broken rail had twisted the lead ropes together, and every frightened pull tightened the tangle. Wade came beside Julia with his knife open. Tell me where. Free the sorrel. Do not touch Belle's rope yet. He obeyed without argument. Owen appeared from the hall with 3 ranch hands. Families crowded the doorway. Get them inside, Julia ordered. Children first, then clear every wagon from the downhill side. Owen turned at once and moved the onlookers back. Julia caught the sorrel's cheek strap and spoke low until the animal's head stopped jerking. Wade cut one loop from the rail, then braced the timber against his thigh while she eased the horse backward. A mule at the far end kicked the ground. The movement rippled through the line. Belle lunged. The rope burned across Julia's palm before she caught it around her forearm. Wade reached for her, but she shook her head. Hold the rail. He planted both boots in the mud. Julia moved close enough for Belle to smell her coat. Easy, girl. You know me. Sleet clung to the mare's lashes. Julia loosened the pressure 1 inch at a time. When Belle lowered her head, Julia freed the twisted lead and sent Wade's gelding toward an open wagon wheel. Now the gray team, once the quiet pair was removed, space opened along the line. The remaining horses stopped fighting one another. Within minutes, the yard held separate animals instead of one panicked mass. No horse had gone down. No wagon had overturned. Julia rested one hand on Belle's neck. Wade looked at the raw stripe across her palm. You need that wrapped. When the rail is reset, that hand will stiffen. Then work quickly. For the first time that evening, he smiled without sadness. They lifted the broken end together. Wade drove the post deeper, while Julia directed the ropes on 2 separate rings. Owen returned after clearing the doorway and took the hammer. You were right about the gray team, he told Julia. They were the only pair not pulling against each other. You saw that from across the yard. She sees most things, Wade said. Julia glanced at him. He did not look away. The warmth of that small defense lasted only until she reached for her dance card. Her pocket was empty. She found it beneath the wagon tongue, pressed into the mud by a boot heel. The cream paper had turned brown along one side. One corner was bent nearly through, and the pencil names had bled into pale shadows. Wade crouched beside her. I am sorry. You did not drop it. No, I only gave it reason to be out here. Julia wiped the card against the cleanest part of her skirt. The final line was still visible. Owen led the last child through the doors, then returned to secure the wagons. He noticed the card in Julia's hand and the way Wade stood close enough to shield it from the rain. The second tune had ended during the confusion. 3 dances remained. Julia folded the card along the damaged edge. We should get everyone inside. Wade looked toward the hall. You should sit out the next dance. Because of my hand. Because you have done enough. She tucked the card into her dress. You keep deciding that for me. His face closed. Julia regretted the sharpness, but not the truth. They crossed the yard together. Owen followed with the hammer over one shoulder. Behind them, the horses stood quiet beneath the repaired rail. At the hall entrance, Wade paused beneath the eaves. Julia stepped inside. A blast of wind struck the western wall. One shutter tore loose and slammed hard enough to shake the lantern hooks. Above the dry corn garlands, a glass lamp swung out over the crowded floor. Clear the center. Julia's voice cut through the music before the lantern struck the garlands. People backed toward the walls. A chair scraped over the floor. The lamp swung once, twice, its flame bending against the glass. Wade moved beneath it. The shutter first, Julia called. If it hits again, the hook will tear loose. She seized a coil of harness leather from beside the coat pegs and tossed one end upward. Wade caught it, stepped onto the narrow wall brace, and climbed high enough to reach the lantern chain. The shutter slammed again. Julia dragged a table away from the wall and held the lower brace steady with her uninjured hand. Wade lowered the lamp until she could catch it against her shoulder. Got it, she said. He looped the leather through the broken latch and pulled the shutter tight against the frame. Owen climbed onto a bench to help him knot it while Julia carried the lantern to a bare section of wall. The room exhaled. No glass had broken. No dry husk had caught flame. The fiddler lowered his bow. Seems a shame to waste a cleared floor. A few people laughed, not from cruelty but relief. Wade stepped down from the brace. Mud streaked his trousers. Rain darkened his shoulders. Julia stood opposite him beneath the lantern she had just secured. The fiddler played 4 testing notes. Turner, someone called from beside the stove. Let us see whether your feet remember. The room quieted. Wade looked at Julia. For one breath, he did not look toward the doorway. He offered his hand. Julia's pulse changed, but she placed her fingers in his. His grip was careful around her burned palm. He stepped left, guiding her into the open space as though the years between dances had been no more than a pause between measures. He still remembered. So did she. The fiddler eased into a slow phrase. Wade turned her once beneath the lantern light. His movements were restrained, but grace remained in them, buried, not gone. A clean warmth spread through Julia that asked nothing from tomorrow. Then Mrs. Tally smiled from the food table. Why, Wade, you have not forgotten a thing. He released Julia's hand. The music stopped with him. A silence fell that was sharper than any gossip. Wade looked around the hall and seemed to see every witness at once, the younger couples. The widows beside the stove. Owen near the shutter. Julia standing in the center with mud on her skirt and the damaged dance card hidden against her ribs. You deserve better than this, he said. Julia's face cooled. Then what? A man who needs a storm to make him cross a room? No one moved. Wade took another step backward. A man with years enough to give you? Julia heard pity gather around them, and it angered her more than mockery would have. You think years are yours to promise. I know how many I have already spent. And you think that gives you the right to spend mine for me? He flinched. Owen lowered his eyes. The fiddler rested his bow across the strings. Wade's voice dropped. I am trying not to bind you to grief. You are not protecting me from grief. You are protecting yourself from joy. The words landed without force because truth needed none. Julia took the dance card from her dress. The paper was damp and muddied. One corner hung by a thin fold. She found a pencil beside the chalkboard and drew a firm line through the empty place at the bottom. 2 dances remained. The faint erased initials from 3 earlier Octobers still showed beneath the stain. Julia handed the card to the fiddler. There is no name for the last dance. Wade stared at the crossed line. Julia, no. She turned toward the cider table, then stopped. And if you change your mind before the final tune, that place will still be empty. Julia did not look toward Wade again. She returned to the cider table, replaced the cracked cup with a clean one, and asked 2 girls to carry fresh plates of apple cake to the benches. The hall slowly found its rhythm. Boots struck the boards. The fiddlers began the 5th dance. Her burned palm throbbed each time she lifted the ladle. Owen waited until the first couples had taken the floor before approaching. He carried Julia's wool shawl over one arm. You left this by the coat pegs, he said. Thank you. He did not offer to place it around her shoulders. He handed it over and gave her room to decide what came next. I leave for Denver after sunrise, he said. The cattle market will keep me there nearly 3 weeks. Julia folded the shawl against her waist. When I return, I would like permission to call at your ranch. Across the room, Wade stood beside the repaired shutter. He was not watching the dancers. His eyes remained fixed on the dark line Julia had drawn through the final place on her card. Owen followed her glance but did not use it against her. You need not answer tonight, he said. And I am not asking because another man failed to. Julia met his gaze. That is why I will answer tonight. He waited. You are a good man, Owen. You speak plainly, and you have treated me with respect. But it would be wrong to reward your honesty with half of mine. The music continued around them. Julia tightened her fingers around the shawl. I do not want to be courted because I am tired of waiting for someone else. That would make you a shelter, not a choice. Owen's disappointment showed, but so did understanding. Then I am glad I asked before I began imagining an answer. So am I. He offered his hand. Julia gave him her uninjured one. No hard feeling, he said. None. He stepped back toward the wall, leaving Julia with no promised future to display before the room. There are people who call their fear sacrifice because the word sounds kinder in the mouth. But protection becomes another kind of prison when it denies someone the right to choose. How many hearts have been left waiting by a person who insisted that silence was mercy? Julia wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and returned to her duties. The 5th dance was still underway. Near the stove, Mr. Bellamy stood alone while his daughter carried trays from the kitchen. His wife had been gone 7 years, and age had made his left knee stiff but not useless. Julia crossed to him. Will you dance with me? His brows rose. Miss Price, I have not managed a proper turn since Grant took Richmond. Then we will avoid anything ambitious. He laughed and allowed her to lead him onto the floor. Julia adjusted her step to his. She kept the turn small, the pace even, and her sore hand light against his sleeve. When his daughter saw them, the strain left her face. The dance was not a declaration. It was not revenge. It was simply music shared with a man who had been standing alone. When the tune ended, Mr. Bellamy bowed with grave dignity. You saved an old fellow from becoming part of the furniture. You kept time better than half the room. The musicians retuned for the final piece. 1 dance remained. Julia moved through the hall once more. She checked the stove damper, counted the serving knives, and made certain the children waiting near the kitchen had rides home. The work steadied her because it had an end. Wade took 1 step toward her. Julia removed the damaged dance card from beside the fiddler. The torn ribbon dangled from its corner. Mud had dried across the lower half, and the dark pencil line remained firm over the place she had once protected for him. She did not tear it. She laid it on the narrow table by the doorway. Julia, Wade said. The first notes of the final dance rose behind her. She pulled her shawl close and opened the door. Sleet swept across the threshold. Wade reached the center aisle, but Julia did not stop. The door shut hard behind her. Wind rushed through the gap beneath it, caught the bent dance card, and sent it sliding across the floor. It stopped beneath Wade's boot. Wade bent and lifted the dance card from beneath his boot. The paper had dried stiff around the mud stain. 1 corner was nearly torn away, and the ribbon hung in 2 frayed lengths. Beneath the line Julia had drawn through the final space, he could still see 3 faint places where his initials had once been written and erased. The fiddlers played behind him, couples moved onto the floor. Wade stood in the aisle holding 4 years of patience in one damaged hand. Owen came to his side but did not speak. She left. Wade said, "Yes. I was trying to spare her." Owen looked toward the closed door. She did not ask to be spared. The same words Julia had given him outside the wagon line returned with greater weight now. Wade had heard them then. He had simply mistaken hearing for understanding. He folded the card along its old crease, carefully avoiding the weakened corner. "The last tune has begun," Owen said. Wade looked down at his ranch boots, wet with mud and too heavy for the floor. Then he turned and walked back into the storm. The sleet had hardened. It struck his face and collected along the brim of his hat. Julia's tracks crossed the yard toward the road, already filling with white. For one wild instant, Wade considered following them. But a man who had hidden for 3 years had no right to arrive at her porch breathless, frightened, and demanding an answer before she had even reached home. He stopped beside his wagon. The grain sack beneath the seat was soaked through. Wade pulled it free and untied the cord. Inside lay the black dance boots his wife had polished the autumn before she died. He had carried them to every harvest social since, telling himself that bringing them meant he had not entirely abandoned the life he once knew. The leather was dry and cracked across the toes. Water had darkened the seams. When he forced his right foot inside, the edge of the heel separated with a soft tearing sound. Wade stared at it. The boot had waited too long as well. Owen crossed the yard carrying the coil of harness leather left from the shutter repair. "I thought you might need this." Wade sat on the wagon step. "You ought to be inside." "So should you." Owen knelt, cut a narrow strip, and passed it over. Wade wrapped the leather beneath the heel and pulled it tight around the instep. His fingers shook from cold, though he knew the weather was not the cause. "Will you take her a message?" he asked. "No." Wade looked up. Owen's expression held no anger. "I will help mend a boot. I will not speak to Julia for you." "That is fair. She has had enough men deciding what she ought to hear." Wade gave one slow nod and tightened the knot. The second boot fit better, though its leather protested when he stood. He took 2 steps through the mud. The bound heel held. Owen rose beside him. "What will you do when you get inside?" "I do not know." "That has been your answer too long." Wade looked through the open doors. Lantern lights spread across the sleet, and the final tune moved warm and steady inside the hall. "I will tell the truth. To Julia, to everyone who watched me make her wait." Owen studied him. "And then, I will take her shawl home if they let me. Tomorrow, I will ask whether she will see me. And if she says no," Wade looked at the torn card in his hand, "then I will live with the answer I finally gave her the right to make." Owen held out his hand. Wade clasped it once. The walk from the wagon to Harvest Hall was no more than 30 yards, but Wade felt every step. Mud marked the toes of the black boots. Sleet gathered in the cracks. The repaired heel shifted beneath him, but did not fail. He reached the doorway as the musicians entered the final passage. Inside, the dancers turned beneath the lanterns. Mr. Bellamy stood near the stove, smiling tiredly. The hall organizer gathered abandoned cups. Several faces turned toward Wade as his damaged boots crossed the threshold. For the first time in 4 Octobers, he entered Harvest Hall while the music was still playing. He looked toward the place where Julia always waited at the edge of the floor. It was empty. Wade stood just inside Harvest Hall while the final dance continued without Julia. The fiddler saw him first. His bow faltered, then recovered. Wade raised one hand. "Finish it." The couples kept moving. He crossed the floor alone. Every step of the damaged boots sounded louder than the music. Mud marked the boards. The leather binding beneath his right heel creaked, but held. Wade stopped where Julia had stood at the beginning of the evening, near the edge of the lantern light. From there, she had watched the door for 3 years while he called remaining outside restraint. Now the doorway stood open behind him, and no one waited there. "Mrs. Tally whispered near the food table. "Mr." Bellamy turned his chair toward the floor. The hall organizer held Julia's folded shawl across both arms. Wade did not ask the musicians to start again. He waited until the final note ended. The bow lowered, boots stopped. Wade removed his hat. Julia Price did not leave because she was fickle. He said, "She did not embarrass herself, and she did not waste these past years." No one interrupted. "She offered me an honest choice. I answered it with silence, then called that silence kindness." His voice carried to the back wall. I told myself I was sparing her from an old man's grief. Truth is, I was sparing myself from the chance she might choose me and from the fear that I might be happy if she did. Wade held up the damaged dance card. Mud darkened its lower half. The torn ribbon shifted between his fingers. She left this place open 3 times. Tonight, she closed it. She had every right. Someone near the kitchen murmured that Julia ought to have waited until the music ended. Wade turned toward the voice. No. The words stopped the room. She waited long enough. If there is shame here tonight, it belongs to the man who stood outside while she kept making room for him. The hall organizer stepped forward with Julia's shawl. Will you take this to her? Wade looked at the folded wool. If you believe she would want me to, she would want it returned, the woman said. What she wants after that is hers to say. Yes. He accepted the shawl and wrapped the torn card inside it. Owen came through the doorway, wet from the sleet. Mrs. Tally glanced between the men. Perhaps Mr. Mercer should call tomorrow. He at least knew how to ask. Owen removed his gloves. No, ma'am. A stir passed through the room. Miss Price is not a prize one man loses and another claims. I asked her plainly. She answered plainly. That answer deserves the same respect as any yes. The words settled more firmly than applause could have. Mr. Bellamy rose with effort. The young lady managed this hall, saved our horses, and kept us from setting the corn garlands aflame. Seems she can manage her own heart. A few quiet smiles appeared. Wade looked at the chalkboard. All 6 dances had been crossed away. There was no 7th line and no tune left to request. That was right. Entering the hall did not give him back the dance. He turned toward the door. Mrs. Tally called after him. Are you going to her now? Wade paused at the threshold. Sleet hissed beyond the lantern light. No. Several faces changed with surprise. She has had men deciding the hour and manner of things for her all evening. I will not arrive at her house in the dark and ask her to settle my conscience. He tucked Julia's shawl beneath his coat. I will go tomorrow, in daylight. I will return what is hers. Then I will ask whether she is willing to hear me. And if she is not, Mrs.? Tally asked. Wade glanced at the mud-streaked boots. Then I will accept the answer I should have let her give years ago. He stepped outside. Behind him, the hall remained quiet, not with pity, but with the understanding that no public confession could earn Julia's hand. The repaired heel held across the yard. By the time Wade reached his wagon, the last lanterns were being lowered. He placed Julia's shawl beside him on the seat, protected beneath his coat, and turned the horses toward home. For the first time, he carried no promise from her, only the choice to walk to her porch the following evening and ask. By the following evening, the sleet had passed, leaving the yard hard and silver beneath a clear sky. Wade walked from the road instead of driving to Julia's porch. He wore his ordinary coat and the black dance boots, their cracked leather newly oiled, the right heel still bound with Owen's strip of harness leather. Julia opened the door before he knocked. Wade removed his hat. Beneath one arm, he carried her folded shawl. The damaged dance card rested inside it. I came to return these. Julia accepted the shawl but left the card in his hand. You may keep that until you have said what brought you here. He looked down at the torn ribbon. I used your future to hide from mine, he said. I told myself my age made me wiser about what you should choose. It only made me more practiced at fear. Julia stood inside the doorway, one hand against the frame. I heard what you said at the hall. I meant every word. Words are easier after the music stops. Yes. He did not defend himself. The porch lantern moved in the evening wind. Wade placed the card on the rail between them. Mud stained the lower edge, and the final line remained crossed through. I am not asking you to restore what I let pass, he said. I am asking whether you would allow me to court you from here forward, openly, without deciding your answer before you give it. Julia watched him. Do you want a courtship or one dance because an empty hall frightened you? Wade looked toward the pasture, then back to her. I want mornings when you tell me I repaired a fence badly. I want suppers where you disagree with me beside the stove. I want to walk into town with you and let people know I'm grateful you chose the road with me. His voice softened. But I will not call any of it mine unless you choose it. Julia looked at the boots. You wore those again. They complain less when they are used. So do some men. A quiet laugh escaped him. It did not erase the years he had spent outside the hall. It did not repair the card or return the final tune. It only made the porch feel large enough for something new. Wade held out his hand. Will you give me one dance? There is no music. I know, and I did not save it. I know that too. Julia placed her hand in his. They moved slowly across the porch boards. Wade's first step was careful because of the bound heel. Julia adjusted without mentioning it. His palm rested lightly against hers, and the rhythm came from creaking boards, wind beneath the eaves, and their measured breathing. When the turn ended, Wade did not hold her after she stopped. Julia kept her hand in his. You may call on Sunday, she said. His eyes lifted. In daylight. In daylight, through the front gate, and you will come inside. I will. Months later, Harvest Hall opened beneath rows of lanterns. The door stood wide to the autumn night. Wade crossed the threshold beside Julia instead of watching from the darkness. His boots carried porch scuffs over the old mud marks, and the repaired heel held firm. Inside Julia's glove, the torn dance card remained exactly as it had been, not restored, not hidden, and no longer a promise she had to protect alone. The last dance had never needed music. It had only needed Wade Turner to step forward and ask,